Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we're going to be resuming our conversation with a couple of friends of mine from down in Louisiana. We're going to resume our discussion about the Atchafalaya Delta, the Wax Lake Delta, the historical development of that area and the waterfowl response to it, and then importantly, how those waterfowl abundances began to change, probably over the past 20 to 30 years. And we're going to have a conversation, speculative conversation in some respects about what might have been going on there. So we're going to jump right into it. Larry and Mike, thank you guys for joining us here again on the podcast and welcome back.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And let's see, I have to decide here who I'm going to throw this first question to, and perhaps I will throw it to you, Mike. You told us on the last episode that you were manager at the Atchafalaya Delta WMA for a number of years. So what I'll get you to do is remind me what those years were, and then tell us a bit about your responsibilities there and how those duties enabled you to see and appreciate the waterfowl abundance, the importance of that region to waterfowl. So what were the years, and just describe a bit of your duties.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I was there from 93 to 98. But I'll backtrack a little bit, because when I was at Marsh Island prior to that, from 85 to 93, I helped with some of the aerial surveys, and I kind of forgot about that to start looking at some of this data. So we started, apparently, the historical data, I think I was involved in from the beginning, which the aerial surveys of all the coastal areas, which included Atchafalaya Delta, starting in 1988, 89. And I was one of the rare guys back in the day that was a biologist, but also did law enforcement. So I did law enforcement work on the wax primarily, because the guys at the main Delta really weren't spending a lot of time there. So I did go, my first hunt there was in 88, but I actually started doing some law enforcement work probably in about 89 or 90. I can't even remember exactly. But the duties when I transferred to Atchafalaya Delta, in addition to continuing aerial surveys, we did bag checks, right? Checking hunters. I kind of oversaw the campgrounds work, and then also had Ile-de-Nere's Barrier Island Refuge. So we did, that stuff over to the east of the Barrier Island work there. But the work at Atchafalaya was, assisting with students, like we talked about Dr. Frank Rower and his students, helping some of those guys with lodging and logistics and, all oil and gas, and working with the Corps with the dredging and just lots of stuff involved in that kind of work.
As I instructed on the previous episode, it would be very useful for our listeners. Well, I guess number one, to go back and listen to the first episode on this topic if you haven't, but also use Google Earth to your advantage in this conversation to help understand what's going on in some of the places that we're talking about. But also, when you do that, make note that there's no roads leading out there to the Atchafalaya Delta or the Wax Lake Delta. And so, Mike, you were manager out there, and you talked about some lodging. And so it leads me naturally to ask you, did you stay out there to some extent as manager? Or what did that look like? Or were you stationed at some office on the mainland, I guess you might say?
No, that's a good point, and something that I really didn't even think of mentioning. But yeah, no, it's, we would leave from Berwick, right, from the launch there in Berwick on the Atchafalaya River and Coastal, and take a boat down to the headquarters at the main Delta. And I'll just keep calling it the main Delta, but again, the Atchafalaya River Delta. We had a houseboat there with lodging, and also had a small camp up on the bank, and all, run by generators. But we would work, it was essentially like working offshore. We did shift work, typically 8 and 6, 8 days on, 6 days off. That was pretty much our schedule. And as supervisor, I kind of worked, with both groups, both different crews. So I would kind of come and go, just depending on the need. But yeah, so it's extremely remote. And then navigating to the wax, of course, if you look at that, from the Google Earth perspective, and as Larry knows, if you spent much time out there, navigating that place by boat is quite interesting, right? And especially traversing between the two deltas, going out in open bay and trying to make sure you hit those passes, because a lot of these sandbars are submerged by a few inches or a foot or so, and of course, again, it's tidal, and it all looks like open water sometimes, right? So extremely deceiving and extremely challenging in terms of navigation.
Like, how far down the river would you have to travel from the boat launch, Mike? I'm not too familiar with that. Berwick is up at Morgan City, right? And so that river's how far down there?
Yeah, it's just right. It's just out of Morgan City. I think it's about 20 miles, maybe 15 miles or something. It's about a 30-minute trip or so. Now, back in the day, when oil and gas was really booming, you had the offshore supply boats through that river, right? Quite a few of them. And those guys can throw a huge wake. I mean, it's, lots of boats get swamped and whatever if they don't slow down or don't see you. And then the fog, you throw the fog into there. So not only is it quite a trip down the river, and there are sandbars, about halfway down on either side that you just got to make sure you know where you're going. And so, back in the day when GPS first came out, you really depended on that and radar quite a bit. So yeah, that's what made it so dynamic, I guess, and so interesting, is that it was such a cool place. But then that added to part of the job in terms of when it got more popular with hunters. Many of them learned that the hard way. And of course, we had to assist with them. We had to assist in night rescues, which is, a challenge in its own, navigating that in the dark, right? Trying to find somebody. We'd get those calls, right? Enforcement really wasn't around there, and we were stationed there. So sheriff's office, it was kind of like, would y'all mind going? So we would often go, from the main delta across the bay to the wax, to go try to find somebody out. A lot of times they didn't know where they were, right? They were heading south, it was, anyway, those kinds of things made it really interesting, to say the least. Talk about stories. Whew.
Well, Mike, what was the craziest story with regard to one of those rescues? Do you have one off the top of your head?
Well, this one reminds me, that rescue reminds me. It was an agent out of Iberia Parish. I won't say his name, but anyway, he called me and said, "Hey, man, I don't remember, cousin or friend or something. They called him and they're lost. They're somewhere on the wax." That's somewhere on the wax, right?
Yeah.
So you're looking at, okay, we got about 30,000 acres of where they could be in that, spider web of splays and passes. And, we found him. And he was way out at the end of a splay, and he thought he was going, and I told him, "Okay, follow me." He's like, "Well, that's not the right direction." And I'm like, "Okay, where do you think it is?" And it was south. I mean, he was heading to Cuba. So, and people just, and I remember with GPS, I mean, we had to really, that's when I first got introduced to it, when it kind of first came out, and they were still kind of, you didn't have really good readings, right? Because that was still kind of monitored or scrambled or whatever by the military. But, I remember staff, we were working the wax, and we would work late hunters, till after dark. And then we had to get back to the main delta, and they're like, "Okay." I said, "You want to follow me?" And they're like, you're going to go through the bay? And I'm like, "Yeah, man, I got a GPS." So anyway, that was one of the stories that really sticks out, but there were lots of those.
What did people do before GPS? Did you just have to go during the day, I would imagine, or just what did you do then?
Yeah. A lot of folks, geez, Larry, I don't know if you remember any of those times camping on the wax. You could you could hear them. You could hear them running, and then you could hear them hitting land.
Yeah, you figured it out, Mike. You just figured it out.
Figured it out.
I still remember one day when we hit that. You'd be going down the Atchafalaya River, and then at one point you just hit this bank of fog, and we knew we were still a couple of miles north on the river of getting to the management area. I was always shooting for buoy 56 because there are navigation buoys in the river, and we would take compass bearings. I had a sheet of paper with compass bearings from each buoy to find my way down there. Well, I hit this wall of fog, and I was actually hunting with Bren Haas, the head of CPRA right now. And when we hit that wall of fog, he pulled out his GPS unit, and I pulled out my GPS unit, and we looked at each other, and I spoke first. And I said, I have this, but I don't know how to use it. I was hoping you did. And Bren Haas looked at me and he said, damn, that's the exact same thing I was thinking. But you know what we did? We put our GPS units away and we found our way. And that was how we did it in those days. We just, you had a compass, so you knew you weren't headed to Cuba. And then, and that's important. That's really important, as Mike will tell you.
Very important. Because, you see lights out there, and those guys would see rigs and thinking they were looking at, Belle Isle or something, It's just
You're right.
Man.
You're right.
Wow.
But no, we didn't wait. We didn't wait until daylight, Brazier. Come on, man.
Well, I didn't know. I mean, it just shows you how little experience I have on those big river systems in those areas. I would have been one of the people that would have been hitching a ride with you and saying, "Hey, I hope you know how to do this."
Well, and Mike also, those crew boats, those oil supply boats that are coming up the river, of course, they have radar, and so most of the time they could see you, and you could hear their motor. And what you would do is you would hear them shut down. You would hear them, going full RPMs, and then they would shut down, and then they would fire back up. Now it's dark and you're running down river and they're coming up river. But by them shutting down and then getting back up, they were leaving a hole in that 4 to 8 foot wake that they throw. And your job was to find that hole to get through it. And that's how you did it. And the first couple of times it's unnerving. But the only time I ever had any trouble was when the guy didn't shut down. And then I knew there wasn't a hole in the wake, and I had to find the quickest cut I could find immediately. Mike and I could tell these stories all day.
Humbling experiences. I can tell you that. I definitely have lost years of my life from some of those days, no doubt.
But that's relevant here, because what it says is that at the other end of that travel, there would lie a reward that you would remember and that would keep you going back time and time again, right?
Amen.
And that's what we want to talk about here. And so, Mike, I guess I wanted to ask you about some of the waterfowl surveys that you conducted back then, and what some of the numbers were, and what we saw in terms of a waterfowl response to this new source of habitat, this new abundant food resource. What are we talking about there in terms of waterfowl numbers?
Okay, yeah. So, and I printed out a graph that I had done for when we proposed that 2 o'clock closure back in 2007. And it started again with the 1988 to 89 survey and went through 2006, 2007. And I'll just show you, just real quickly, talk about some peaks. And I kind of mentioned it on that first email exchange. It kind of started this, that I thought that I recalled one of the higher counts was around just under 250,000 birds. And this was in 1989 and 90. 1989 and 90. Let me make sure that's right. No, I take that back. This was 93, 94. We had peaks, and then also 88, 89. We had peaks just at the Wax Delta, just under 160,000 birds and, waterfowl. And that was just on the Wax Delta. And then on the main Delta during those same counts, we were just right under 100,000. So, there was your 200, nearly a quarter million ducks. That was some of the peaks. And a lot of those were close to, across the board in those earlier years. A lot of them were over 100,000 just at the wax. And usually it was less at the main delta because the habitat, again, was a little bit different, a little bit less productive. But phenomenal numbers, and Larry's seen that. Back in those days, it boggled my mind, and it still does, to remember flying over, and even during when the season was open, because some of these numbers were during the open season, and those birds would just raft up right off, in a little bit deeper water, not very deep, but just outside of the hunters, and just phenomenal rafts of. And I really remember the mallard, pintail, and canvasback numbers just being, it seems like you would fly for miles, and it was just solid, ducks touching each other, just these massive rafts, and so those that was the kind of numbers we had back in the day. And then, of course, numbers nowadays, Larry can attest to, but if you looked at the number, the November survey for Atchafalaya Delta, it was, I don't know, I think about 7,000 birds. I got it down here somewhere, but, yeah.
Now, Larry, your transect lines that we spoke about on the previous episode do not intersect with with either of these deltas, right? And that's not to say that you're not kind of extrapolating to them on the basis of this design, but just kind of the surveys that Mike is talking about here with the 250,000 birds there on the deltas are not the same surveys that you fly, right? And do you have a transect that runs near these deltas?
Yeah, you're correct, Mike. The purpose of my survey, if I can use that terminology, is to estimate the number of ducks in southeast Louisiana and southwest Louisiana. So the transects that I fly are a systematic random sample of all the habitats in those surveyed areas. The surveys that Mike's talking about are specific to the wildlife management areas. Now, it just so happens that line 19 of my survey does almost bisect the main Atchafalaya Delta. It comes across from Point of Fur Island and runs up East Pass and then goes north from there. And so we do have one line that cuts part of that area, but the inference space of my survey is the entire coast, where the survey data that you see from the WMA survey is specific to each WMA. And I was gonna tell Mike, it's how difficult change is on all of us. As Mike said, there were about 7,000 birds.
No, I'm sorry. I just looked.
It was actually.
I looked at the data. I was like, "Oh my God, I was off."
It's only 700.
Oh my
Yeah, I had to pull that page. I was like, "Oh, I think that was way too much." Yeah, 714 at the main delta and 684 at the wax. It's like, geez,
wow.
We would hardly even include that in our counts, when we were dealing with rafts of thousands of birds, right? Yeah. Wow. Disturbing.
And that's what stimulated the back and forth email exchange. Like, what's going on when you talk about a decline from a 250,000 birds down to less than, 1,000 on each of the deltas? Like, what's going on? And that's kind of where this exchange started. And it relates to some changes in hunting pressure to kind of get, right to the story of where things we're going to be talking about. But in order to kind of pull out some of what may be going on, I wanted to ask you guys just to sort of share some of your stories about that. Larry, I'll start with you. Get you just to talk about how and when you started hunting the deltas. What were your experience there, and kind of what did your hunting experience through the years look like, and your decisions on kind of when to stop trying to hunt down there?
My experience at the Atchafalaya Delta started in January of 1990, that 1989-90 season. And remember, those were 30-day seasons with 3 duck limits.
Larry, that turned out to be the high point as we now know it, right? Pretty much the high point. It was all down from there.
It really was. I remember that first time that I hunted there. I caught on pretty quickly that we would go out at low tide. We actually would put decoys in those moonscape divots that Mike talked about in the last podcast, and we'd wait for the tide to come up, and we would hunt the birds coming up on the tide. There was very little cover out there. We would make makeshift blinds out of wax myrtle, or we would coddle up to a couple of big logs that had washed up on those mud flats, and we had excellent hunting. In fact, the story I like to tell is that last weekend of the season in January of 1990, we saw 2 other boats the entire weekend. We had the whole place to ourselves, and that was the way the hunting was pretty much 1990, 91, 92. In 92, the teal season was reopened after 5 years of being closed, and the teal hunting in September at the Atchafalaya Delta, I actually kneeled down in the Delta duck potato on those flats and had no problems harvesting blue-winged teal. In 1995 and 96, the hunting pressure really increased. You might remember in 95, we went to 50-day seasons with 5 duck limits. In 97, 60-day seasons with 6 duck limits. And so the hunting pressure on the wax delta, which is where I'd hunted to then, chased me over to the main delta. And the main delta was where I did my hunting. Again, the same strategies. I would motor around the passes looking for birds. Then I'd park my boat and either slog my decoys and my gear out onto the flats, or push pole my Piro if the water was deep enough. And that was how I hunted. But more and more people, I think Mike will probably talk about the improvements in GPS, a lot of internet communication between hunters. There were a lot more people down there hunting. It became more competitive, but that was okay. All I had to do was work a little harder, find more remote places. But then, and again, I'm going to come off as cliche, but then I started getting passed by people in surface drive motors. First, the long tail Go Devils. I had parked my outboard motored boat on the shores of the pass, and I was walking or hauling a sled or paddling a Piro, and somebody would go past me in a surface drive motor. I had a spot that I hunted regularly off Teal Pass on the main delta. I had a spot that it was all I was physically capable of doing, with parking my boat, getting out past the reforestation project and into this little slough in front of Andrew Island. And no one could get in there to Andrew Island. And I had excellent hunting for a couple of years until somebody with a surface drive motor motored past me and my decoys, and got into that side of Andrew Island. And both of us had excellent hunting for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then that was it. And so it became obvious to me in 2004, 2005, and definitely by 2006 that I either had to retool, get a different boat and a different motor to be able to compete, or find another place to hunt. And my last hunt on the main Atchafalaya Delta was in 2006, simply because I was unable to compete. And that reward that you talked about was no longer worthwhile. That 17-mile run down the Atchafalaya River, it it was no longer worth it for me.
Larry, I've only been hunting at the Delta once. I came to Louisiana in 2005, and I hunted there only once. Actually, Dr. Frank Rohr took me out one day, and we hunted it much as you described. He anchored his boat in one of the channels, and we trudged off through some brush onto one of the flats, and about the only, now we did shoot some ducks there, but one of my lasting memories was that's not for the faint of heart. Trudging through that mud is not for the faint of heart or those that are out of shape. It will make you work.
Amen.
And so, Mike, I wanted to bring you into this now. Have you talk about some of your hunting experiences? When did you first start? If there's anything that you'd like to add to what Larry said, or if we just wanted to kind of talk about some of the changes in hunting pressure and some of the challenge that it posed to you as a manager, and some of the other things that came along with that. So, what would you like to add here?
Okay. Well, first off, so Julie's home and she just poured a glass of wine and she gave it to me. So I'm going to tell you.
All right.
And she's laughing because I'm telling her, be quiet. They can hear anything you do.
That's right.
Anyway.
But she just saved this podcast.
She just saved it. Well, okay. So I will just say, before I start indulging in finer beverages, that, Larry nailed it, right? He did. And the first hunt I had was in the fall of 88. And I remember it was warm. So it was probably November, probably in the first week or so, with a coworker, fisheries biologist. And, we went right up to the wax, and we went on Campground Island. Larry, you know right where that is, the main campground. Well, it used to be in the day we had the two campgrounds, right? But the main campground, there wasn't much else past that, right? I mean, there was a little bit, but not, and we didn't know what we were doing. We had a handful of decoys, a P-row, and we set up, and it was like mallards just, were coming in, and I was in awe. Because I grew up hunting in Vermilion Parish and with some of my buddies as teenagers, and we had to, we had permission for a little bitty rice field, and we didn't kill any ducks, very few ducks, right? We just, it was slow hunting, and that opened my eyes to, and then of course starting to, do some of the aerial surveys and just see that place and what it was about was phenomenal. The hunts were just, like Larry said, phenomenal. And that was the other thing I will tell you about invasives is that another technique that I often used, if it was a kind of a quick type hunt and you had water hyacinth around you built up a little nutria pad of water hyacinth, you sat in the middle of it and you could kill ducks. I mean, and Larry nailed it with the tide back in the day. Frank talked about that in his comments. Back in the day, when those birds that I was telling you about rafting offshore, when that tide would start coming in, and it could be in the middle of the day, literally, it could be 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. It didn't matter. When that tide started coming up, a lot of times you laid, like he said, you laid your decoys in the sand or in the mud and waited. And when it came up, the droves of birds came with it. It was truly, you thought you were the best caller. You thought the decoy spread was the best. It didn't have to be. I mean, and I could go on. And in my days of working there from 93 to 98, 1 year, and I will say, but the hunting was so good that I could do this during my work hour, right? Before I started work, I could go make a 15-minute hunt most of the time. I mean, that's not bragging. It's just, it's a lot of that's a fact. And it wasn't every day, but there were many days that were like that. And I hunted a lot. I mean, I really did. I hunted a whole lot. I stayed out there a lot.
Yeah, sure, Mike. If you're 15 minutes away from one of the best hunting spots on the planet, why not go and do that and then get back to work?
And less than 15 minutes, right? I mean, even, I'd go right around Log Island Pass, just right there. And we could tie that into enforcement work. I remember making cases when canvasback was closed, and there were droves of canvasback. And, making cases of people shooting canvasbacks, they would leave them and I'd see them floating by me. I'd go pick them up and I'd go write them up, I mean, that was some of the fun. But you got, you got a rapport with a lot of the other hunters, the good guys, and found out what they were doing, where the birds were. And then of course, having the advantage of flying surveys and being out there a lot, just added to it. And then of course the change of watching the numbers, and Larry nailed that, social media, but primarily some of the magazines started printing stuff. And I'll never forget I won't use names, but one of the authors was on the campground there at the Wax and wanted to interview me. And, as part of my job, I kind of, I had to do it pretty much, but I knew where that was going and what that was going to do. And it didn't matter, right? It wasn't so much that article, but, those things were happening. And you saw, like Larry said, the advance of shallow drive boats and what that became, and what it did to resting birds and shooting all day. And there were things about the glory of that was so fun, but there were things about it that was, that was really sombering, I'll say. So I'll leave it at that without going. But again, we could go on for days with these comments,
Mike and Larry, that is as good a place as any, probably, to wrap up this episode. We certainly have more to discuss on this issue, specifically related to how you as a manager became concerned about some of these changes that you were seeing with regard to bird numbers, and likely some increased access, increasing pressure being responsible for some of those changes, and then what your agency tried to do in response. So let's wrap up here and then have you guys rejoin us to continue this discussion. Mike, Larry, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Mike Carlos with Ducks Unlimited's Southern Regional Office and former manager of the Atchafalaya Delta Wildlife Management Area, and Larry Reynolds, Waterfowl Program Manager for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. We certainly appreciate their time, their stories, and I appreciate their friendship. We thank our producer, Clay Baird, a digital warrior, for all the great work that he does with this podcast and getting it out to you. To you, our listener, we thank you for your support of this podcast, and most importantly, we thank you for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.